Okay, folks, so this is the first of the jog pods for the Migration Identity and Sovereignty Unit. So what I'm going to do here is, as I've done with all the other paper 2 human geography jog pods, is do a whistle-stop tour, a very quick run-through recap of the different content areas, inquiry questions, if you like, of the Migration Identity and Sovereignty Unit. Now, to begin with, what I want to do is delve into the pupil learning checklist, which you've all got access to, and you've all got hard copies. You can get these on the Sixth Form Learning platform as well. It's not these middle parts I want to focus down onto, because that's the individual lessons that we're going to go through, but it's these overall topic areas. So as this recording is for inquiry question 1, here is the inquiry question 1 question. What are the impacts of globalization on international migration? Now, that is broken down into these key parts here. Now, I'm going to just zoom in on this a little bit. There we go. So the first part of that is globalization has led to an increase in migration, both within countries and among them. Now, that's really focusing down on where it says within countries, internal migration, so moving from one part of the country to the other. And the example case study that you'd have looked at for inquiry question 1 there was China. And where it says among them in that statement, that's across borders. So that's international migration. Now, the good thing with EQ1 in particular of this unit is there is some superb synoptic links back to the globalization unit and also the diverse places unit as well. There's also some really good links to superpowers. So this is why we teach this to you last, because there are so many synoptic links here. The second part of EQ1, where it says here 8b.2, is looking at the causes of migration. It says there the causes of migration are varied, complex, and subject to change. And that's really where we delved into why do people move? What's causing that movement of people from place to place, either internally or across border internationally? Delving into push factors of migration, pull factors of migration. The EQ1 then progressed on to the final part of the EQ, which is the consequences of international migration that are varied and disputed. So they are the 3 big elements of EQ1. So now what I want to do is, as I said, do a quick whistle-stop tour with you to remind you of the different elements of EQ1. Now, just bear with me whilst I get to the right folder here. Migration. Okay. So these are the lessons that we completed together for EQ1. The first one is globalization and migration. So let's just remind ourselves what this included. Now, just before we do this, this doesn't, sorry, let me start again. This supplements your revision. This is not going to get you the A's and the A stars just listening to me here. You've got to be using your own notes, your own classwork, the homework, the prep time work. This is just a reminder of what we have done. I'm not going to be reteaching anything here. So this is where we started here. To understand how globalization has caused people to move, both within and between countries. Now, I think this took us 2 lessons, actually. I'm not going to delve into the areas of the spec because we've just looked at the links to the spec at the start there. Right, where did we begin? Now, we started here reminding ourselves of what is globalization. Now, again, I'm not going to read this off the screen. You can pause this to remind yourself as part of your revision if you want. But this was a condensed down version of what globalization is. And then we also need to bring in what is an economic system as well, because globalization and economic systems are interdependent. They're part of the same process here. And both of these factors, if you like, processes, influence migration. So what we then looked at was the changing patterns of demand for labour. Now, in particular, looking at jobs, employment opportunities, and why that causes people to either leave a place as a push factor because lack of employment opportunities, or why it pulls people to another place internally or across a border for the purpose of jobs and labour. And this last point we were to discuss, it says here, resulted in two processes affecting the demand for labour. We've got to look at this on the national scale, where people move from rural areas, which were predominantly originally agricultural based economies, to work in the cities as part of the urbanisation process. But then also on an international scale, where people are able to move from nation state to nation state, country to country, easier in certain places. And the example that you'd have looked at was the European Union, in particular with the Schengen Agreement. What you then would have looked at or listened to, and we discussed this at the time, was a short video clip by Professor Engin Isin from Queen Mary University of London, where he was discussing what's the basics of migration. What actually is it? Now, I'm not going to replay this to you now. Go back and look at this on the slides yourselves. But the basics of it is this has always happened. It's a natural process. Even before nation states were in existence, people were moving around our planet. You'd have then looked at, very briefly, China's ballooning cities, and in particular the rise of the megacities in Asia. And you made some notes on that and the megacities and why they're on the rise in China, which led very nicely into the first example case study, if you like, of internal migration within a country's borders. And this is where you looked at China. And predominantly here, the movement, the internal movement of people in China is from west to east. A bit of a breakup in the middle from west to central, if you like, and then from central to east. And they're moving over to the east there in search of work, employment, jobs on the coastal regions. And as you'll know, and if you remember, that's where most of the special economic zones, the SEZs, are in China. Part of that process, or part of or something that impacts upon that internal migration movement of people in China, is the Hukou system. So do remind yourselves of what that is and how it works. You'd have then looked at the general impacts of that internal migration in China, in particular areas on the eastern coast, some of those SEZs, where urban sprawl has been a massive effect as a result of that internal movement of people. You'd have then looked at some different maps. You've got a couple of choropleth maps here, and you've got proportional circles at the bottom left to analyze data represented in map format to show where are people moving from and where are people moving to in China. If you look in particular at the bottom right map there, the areas of darkest green are the areas of China where there is the biggest outflows of people, where people are leaving. Whereas the darkest reds are the areas of biggest inflows, where people are moving into. And you can see the pattern there. There's general movement from the western central China over to the eastern coastal regions or provinces. And you'd have then looked at some categories here, some statements, looking at push and pull factors and trying to categorize those statements into push and pull factors of migration in China. The second part of that first lesson was another case study example, looking at the movement of people, the migration of people across borders, so internationally here, from one nation state to another. And the example here you looked at was the Schengen Agreement within the European Union, which has allowed the freedom of movement of people. If you're within the European Union, you can live and work within any other European country of your choice. So do remind yourself of this case study, which led very nicely into the more precise example of this international migration, looking at the Polish migration or the Polish migrants coming to the UK, in particular to the city of Peterborough. And there you looked at, we analysed, we discussed what's pushing them out of Poland, or particular areas of Poland, what's pulling them to the UK and Peterborough. But then looking at again those impacts, the impact on the host country. So 1 minute, my Google Meet is about to kick me out, which we do not want. Let's go back to this. So looking at the impact on Peterborough in the UK, that's social, economic, political, environmental impacts, both positive and negative. And then also what were the impacts and effects in the home and the source country, which was Poland. But that rounded off the first lesson of EQ1. Right, let's nip over to the second lesson, which was titled Complex Migration. So this is where we looked at this learning outcome linked to EQ1 to understand that different countries have varying percentages of ethnic minorities within their population. And there it says migration patterns are subject to change. And this is where we delved into in quite a lot of depth, and you've done some independent work on this, immigration policies. And in particular, you looked at 3 nation states immigration policies. So again, there's the links to the spec if you want to pause it now and have a look. Okay, we discussed some general data here about country of birth measures for different areas of the UK. I'm going to skip over that for now because that was just general discussion at the time. And this is where we started to really get into the crux of the trends in international migration. And we discussed this diagram here that has some key data on it to show where in the world, in terms of regions, subcontinents, if you like, are most people moving from and where are they moving to. So do go back to your notes to remind yourselves of that discussion. And we would have then looked at some overall data on international migration and analysed this graph, which is showing the number of migrants in millions for particular countries. What we then discussed was some examples of an environmental change, which we call that the influencing factor, the economic effects and political events. So these 3 categories, and what were the influencing factors? Now, I'm going to put these all on the screen because then you can pause it. So the influencing factors environmentally, we looked at climate change. The economic was the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And then political events was new conflicts that trigger or diversify global migration flows that cause more people to move. But then each of those 3 factors, we looked at the importance of those factors in terms of causing a change in migration. So remind yourselves of those. We then had a discussion about global variations in migration in terms of it causing population structural change. And then we looked at immigration policy. And this is where we went into the 3 case studies. So if you didn't quite finish these, make sure you finish them. So what we were looking at here was population structure, immigration policy of these particular case study examples. Japan was the first one. So you researched what is Japan's immigration policy? How is Japan's immigration policy impacting upon its ethnic diversity mix in the country itself? Now, I gave you some starter resources, which were these ones on the screen here. So if you want to remind yourselves of those, pause this now. And also these went along with the Japan example as well, alongside wider research that you conducted on Japan's immigration policy. The second country you looked at was Australia. You did exactly the same thing again. What are their policies? What's the overall policy? What policies they got in place to restrict or allow migrants in and out of the country, and the impacts of that on the population structure. So again, I gave you some starter resources. If you want to pause, have a look now. And here was some more that I gave you, to begin with for Australia. So you also looked at the United Kingdom. So we did a 3-way comparison there of Japan, Australia, and the UK in terms of how are their immigration policies different and why are they different? And second of all, how do those policies impact or influence the ethnic mix within a country? What we then did is we looked at these three categories of migrants: voluntary economic migrants, who are migrants or people who move for work purposes. We looked at the big category of refugees, who are migrants, people who are forced to leave their country. There's numerous reasons, numerous push factors: war, disasters, natural disasters, persecution. And then we also introduced the term asylum seeker. And that is a person who is fleeing to another country to apply for the right to international protection. We then looked a bit on the UK, and more of this you did from your research on the UK's immigration policy. So I'm not going to delve into that too much here and now because you'd have done that as part of the case study. I gave you some data as well to go alongside the UK's migration policy and the impacts that it's had on the ethnic makeup of the country. That then rounded off the second lesson of EQ1. Right, let's progress on to lesson 3, which is the causes of migration. Now, let's go into the lesson PowerPoint to remind ourselves of what we did. So the outcome of this lesson was to further understand, because you'd already picked quite a bit up already, the causes of migration, and then evaluate the benefits and problems as a result of that. There's the link to the spec if you want to pause and have a look. What I started this lesson with was an 8-mark exam question, along with a model example answer, which secured 7 out of 8. A bit of a harsh marking going on here by me, but just to prove the point, there was a little something that could have been added in here. Now, the 8-mark question was: explain how pull factors may influence immigration into Europe. Now, 8-marker, 3 separate paragraphs there, which we always recommend for an 8-mark explain question. And each of the paragraphs are peeled. They make a point. They explain the point in general first, no case study example. They then back it up with a very small example, and they link it back to the question. So just pause and have a look at that example answer. But the key bit there, the key improvement was, could this be linked to Lee's migration theory, which I'll mention in a minute. So what we looked at here, we had a general discussion. We did a bit of recap to look at those 3 categories of migrant again. And if you remember, we then listened to some of these clips of migrants telling their story when they've come to the UK. Why did they come? Where did they go? What attracted them here? What allowed them to come here? We introduced some key terms. So the first key term, really important, is diaspora or diaspora, depends how you say it, which is the dispersion or spread of any people from their original homeland. So what we have in certain areas, particular cities, is diaspora communities, where you've got a community of Turkish, for example, a community of Iraqis, a community of Afghans, Indians, and so on, in different places in the city. It's a form of cultural segregation, voluntary segregation, if you like. I did introduce quite early, even though the EQ3 and 4 really are to do with sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty, which is the authority of state to govern itself or another state within its borders. We discussed the term of displacement, what it is, the action of moving something from its place or position. And in terms of bringing that into migration, people can be displaced. We reintroduced the term of capital and reintroduced the term of post-colonial migrants, who are people who moved to the UK in this particular instance from former colonies of the British Empire during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We then looked at, it's not a case study as such, but it is a good example here. We discussed in quite some depth the migration routes for people from the Middle East to North Africa into Europe. And you can see there from that summary map, the arrows are the main migration routes that are taking place. We've got the EU countries, and then we've got EU members that voted to leave, which is basically the United Kingdom. So pause yourself to remind you of that. We then had a brief discussion on the conditions that some of these migrants, in particular, taking some of these routes here. Some of them wanting to get to the UK, not all of them by any means, but some of them do want to get to the UK. Where they end up, and one of the places is the Calais jungle, for example. If you want to pause and have a reread to remind yourself some of the conditions that people are living in and the desperation of some of these migrants to get to Europe and why they do it and how they do it. Again, we looked at some examples here. We had a Syrian man aged 34, which we discussed, and we had a 19-year-old from Egypt that we looked at their story. And also Fiducia, aged 20, from the country of Somalia. We didn't delve into this in too much depth because you know this from GCSE, and we'd already done previously in the first couple of lessons. We discussed many push factors of migration and pull factors. So just remind yourselves of what are the push factors, the general ones, the big four, if you like, tend to be lack of jobs, war, famine, natural disasters. The big four pull factors tend to be in search of better healthcare, economic job opportunities, education, and safety. We then went sort of back to that migration of people from Africa to Europe, looked at some more data presented in different different types of map format. Because don't forget, in the paper two, you are going to get data presented in map format, different types of graphical representation. And then we looked at this. Not all migrants coming to the UK are refugees. So just pause yourself to remind yourself of that. And then we looked at some of the headlines, just some examples from newspapers here, and how the media can influence the perceptions of people on migration. Some positively, but unfortunately, the media often presents this in a negative way. We looked at very briefly, because this is for a future lesson, the idea of open borders and immigration. What is a border? What is an open border? Should we have open borders? Should we not have open borders? And then we looked at how we applied all of this to national identity, looking at what is national identity? How does migration change or alter a national identity of a particular place and a particular group of people? We then link that into sovereignty. What is sovereignty? How does sovereignty either allow or regulate a country to keep its national identity or change it? And then finally, for the lesson three, we looked at two particular negative consequences of international migration, and that led us very nicely into the fourth lesson. So let's delve into the next lesson of EQ1, of migration, identity and sovereignty. And this is looking at internal migration in the UK. Now here was where we had some superb synoptic links back to the diverse places in the globalization unit. So the outcome here was to explain the movement of migrants internally within the UK, and link this to something called the core periphery model, which I introduced early to many of you in the superpowers unit. There's a link to the specs again, if you want to pause. So we started with some keywords here. Overpopulation. Just brace yourself, because my dog is sitting next to me and she can hear another dog outside and think she's about to bark. Just brace yourself if it happens. It's not. So we introduced overpopulation, underpopulation, optimum population. What is the core in terms of a country They tend to be the urban areas of a country. And then what is the periphery? The periphery tend to be the extreme rural areas of a country. We had some more. We looked at what is the trickle down effect, so remind yourself of that. And then we looked at what is a negative externality. So just pause yourself to remind you of those key terms. Now, this is where we spent a good 45 minutes and you looked at these graphs. I'm just going to put them all on the screen here with the notes. And if you remember, you got into groups and you analysed what the graphs were telling you about internal migration patterns within the United Kingdom. Now, this one had three elements. The pink purpley dot shows the net flow. The green bars show the inflow to these areas, and the orangey yellow shows the outflow. So just pause along with rereading the text to remind yourself of that. Said very nicely. And this was a graph you'd also previously seen in the diverse places unit. Again, looking at the flows, the net flows of people, in particular to London, or I say to London, and also out of London. And we discussed why people were moving from certain areas to London, what was the push, what was the pull, and then also why were certain people moving out of London, what was the push, what was the pull. And then you explored these two data sets. One is a choropleth map, which shows Londoners, where Londoners moved to after leaving London itself. Choropleth map, obviously the darker red in this case, is where you've got more people. And the graph on the right is showing net domestic migration moves into and out of London again by age. Go back to your notes on this because there's some key reasonings for different age groups as to why people move in and why certain people move out. What we then discussed was really the bottom right bit here, these four categories. Student migration, the four biggies for students in terms of moving in the UK is living costs, livability, so what's the place like, the actual universities themselves, and also the best cities. And then we supplemented that to finish off with the retired population of the United Kingdom. So just remind yourselves of that as well. So pause here now if you wish. We finished off by looking at depopulation in areas of high unemployment. And we looked at here the cycle of decline here, if you like. So again, pause, remind yourselves of what is this cycle. And also there was an article you were given on the city of Hull. And just to remind you, what is a core area? What is a peripheral area? And that link, there's two diagrams. You can pause it on this one and then supplement it with this one as well. Okay. Let's then delve into lesson 5 of EQ1. And the focus of this one was cultural assimilation. Come on, open up. Here we go. So let's get the learning outcome. Here we are at the bottom. To understand the term assimilation, what does it mean? And explain some of the effects of migration as a result of assimilation. Where did we begin? If you remember, we discussed these images and what do you think are the top 5 things Brits miss about Britain when they move abroad? The big ones are particular food types, the weather, funnily enough, culture and history, the sense of humour and the manners. And these tend to be the 5 things that foreigners say about the Brits as well. We then had a discussion. Again, we looked at some data, the pie chart on the right, ethnic groups in England and Wales in 2011 from the previous census. What was the makeup of the UK? And then we looked at the bar chart, the horizontal bar chart there on the right to supplement that discussion. We then looked at, I got you to read this small article on the Dutch immigration rules in terms of having a culture test. What is a culture test? Why did the Dutch do it? What are the pros of this? What are the cons of this? And then, if you remember rightly, I talked about the UK. We have a life in the UK test for migrants coming here that want to obtain British citizenship. Introduce some key terms. I'm not going to read them through again. Pause them if you wish. What is assimilation? What is the term ethnic? What is the term culture? Now, these all merge into each other. What is the term ethnic segregation? Good synoptic link back there to diverse places. And then we looked at very briefly the example of ethnic segregation in forced ethnic segregation in terms of the apartheid regime in South Africa between 1948 and 1991. We then delved into London. I'm just going to put all this on the screen for you so you can then pause it. Looked at London on the right-hand side, which shows the clustering of particular London enclaves of Asian and Asian British people of Indian descent from the 2011 census. And you can see there was clearly clustering, social clustering and enclaves, diaspora communities, if you like, in particular in the western parts of London. And then the text there was talking a bit about apartheid again, and so on. We then rounded off, I think this was rounding off this particular lesson, looking at the factors affecting the rates of assimilation. So when migrants come to a country, what are the biggest factors affecting how, when, and if they assimilate? Bicultural marriage was a biggie, the level of education, ability to find a job, how heavily they rely on social benefits, which heavily relied upon job availability, the quality of the housing, and the language barriers as well. Oh, sorry, and the average wages. All of those put together, and if you're successful in all of those, I suppose, then you are becoming more assimilated as a migrant. And then we finished off by looking at an example of the Windrush generation when they moved to the United Kingdom as a result of the British government's law that allowed anyone from a previous colony to come and live, work in the UK and get British citizenship. So really good example, this one, of the UK needing migrants to come to the UK to work in many of the services such as the NHS, and they encourage migrants to move here. There's a video there that we watched, so do remind yourself of that. And then we finished off by looking at how has migration changed British culture? In what way has it changed it? How has it changed it? In terms of music, in terms of sport, politics, food. So that rounded off the cultural assimilation lesson. Let's progress on to lesson 6, which was called Perspectives of Migration. Okay, let's remind you of what we did here. We started off again with a particular type of map and data, which shows how attitudes towards immigration vary in relation to the size of the local migrant population. So what this basically tells you is the dark green areas are where people are saying migration, immigration, immigrants enrich their area. It's a good thing. You can see there, predominantly in and around London. Most people are saying that. And then some of the northern cities there, central and northern England. But where you've got the darkest orange tend to be, sorry, that's where people are saying, oh no, immigration is not such a good thing. That tends to be your more rural areas where you don't have so many immigrants living. So basically, areas of the UK, areas of cities mainly, where you do have a larger proportion percentage of migrants, immigrants, the people who are British born and live here see it as a good thing. It enriches their lives. But in rural, they don't experience migrants so much and therefore don't have that same opinion. So this is all about different perspectives, people's opinions on migration. And the outcome here was to empathize how different stakeholders, this is different players, stakeholders within society might view migration. And we could have spoke for lessons and lessons on this. So we had some keywords. What is a stakeholder? Sometimes it's called a player. What does demographic mean? Structure of the population. So remind yourself of those two key terms. And what we looked at here was this choropleth map, looking at measuring cultural diversity within countries and bringing in this idea of cultural fractionization. Pause to remind yourself of that. And then we delved into Japan again, because you previously explored Japan's immigration policy. So I gave you some resources here and we discussed the aging population in Japan. And we looked at some data. We looked at some population pyramids of Japan. So Japan, as you'd have picked up from their immigration policy, is a very homogenous nation. Their immigration policy is very strict. It doesn't allow people in very easily. We then contrasted that, or not contrasted, the wrong word. We looked at another example of the USA-Mexico border. We did mention Donald Trump about when he said, I'll build a great wall on the southern border and I'll make Mexico pay for that wall. Well, good luck to that one on Donald Trump, but that was never going to happen. And this, again, was looking at how a president's policies were starting to influence people's perceptions of migrants coming into their country. And then we looked at this. What do Americans think about migration from Mexico? If we look here, we've got two lines there. We've got Mexican born, we've got Mexican born as all immigrants. Remind yourself of that. Bit of reading here again, what Americans want to do about illegal immigration and what they think about it, what different political parties think about this. And then the task was to complete a worksheet where you had lots of categories, lots of statements related to impacts of migration. And then you were categorizing them into, is this an impact on the host country or the origin country or the source country? And then you categorize them into economic, social, political, and demographic. And then we had a plenary task where we looked at different stakeholders' views. We looked at what does a Japanese student think, American Democrat, and American Republican. So that then led us into the final lesson, which was looking at immigration policies. Now, again, this is very much a recap, if you like, of a previous lesson. Come on, open up. Here we go. And this was the final part of EQ1. Whoops. So the learning objective is to compare, explain, and evaluate two contrasting immigration policies. You ended up doing 3. And again, you'd already started this. This is where you looked at different immigration policies for different countries. In other words, what is a desirable migrant to different countries? So I gave you some information on the UK immigration, the 5-tier visa system. Again, pause it here to remind yourself if you wish. And we then looked at some data, looking at the wealth factor as a really important factor in terms of a country's immigration policy. And different countries have different policies on the amount of wealth someone either has to have or should have or could have to come into your country. Again, a little bit more on wealth here, looking in particular at the Mexicans crossing the border and the migrants from North Africa. And then we looked at the importance of skills, because different countries need different people with different skill sets, and they often bring that into their immigration policies. And Australia, for example, the points-based system. The UK now has a points-based system. And then the third big category is the opportunities, and how opportunities such as work, employment in different countries either force people to move or attract people to move. And we return then to the Schengen Agreement, because the Schengen Agreement allows those people within the EU to live and work in any country they want within the EU. And one of the biggest factors there is the opportunities that another country can give you in terms of work. Contrast that, we mentioned North Korea. Totally the opposite. A very much hard, closed border. They do not allow the freedom of move people in or out. That's a really important point to make. So remind yourself of the North Korea example, which was physical isolation and also digital isolation. Good link back there to the globalization unit, where we looked at censorship and how different regimes and political parties, governments, presidents, if you like, control a nation. And North Korea is a country that is very much switched off to globalization. So that rounded off lesson 7. Now, I don't need to delve into this one really, because this was a webinar discussion. If you want to have a look at that on the learning platform as well, please feel free. So if we return to where we started, these 3 sub-questions of EQ1, globalization has led to an increase in migration both within countries and among them. Second part, the causes of migration are varied, complex, and subject to change. And then the final part of EQ1, the consequences of international migration are varied and disputed. That rounds off the summary of inquiry question 1. What are the impacts of globalization on international migration as part of the Migration, Identity and Sovereignty Unit? Thank you very much, folks.